Hello again. Every time I make one of these videos, it never actually occurs to me to introduce myself, so I'm Hamilton Williams. I've been making pottery for 28-ish years now. I live in Morganton, North Carolina, which is in the foothills, approximately an hour's drive east from Asheville. Today, I'm going to talk about how I have begun to process the clay that the folks over at Foothills Conservancy of North Carolina brought me a week or two ago from their site over in Oak Hill. The Foothills Conservancy is a nonprofit that serves an 8-county area in western North Carolina to permanently protect land and water resources. 2 years ago in 2020, they purchased a 652-acre tract in the Oak Hill community just outside of Morganton, where they plan to establish a park for outdoor recreation, education, agriculture, and archaeological exploration. While they began to get the site ready, they found material they were pretty sure was clay, so they brought me a small sample, which I processed, and found that it seems to be a pretty good stoneware, hopefully very high quality stoneware. The first thing that I do when I get a new clay to test out that's been dug up locally is I make one of these little bars that I can put in my firings and test up to the top temperature that I fire to, which in my case is cone 10. That's 2370 Fahrenheit or 1300 Celsius. That's the temperature that my glazes mature to and that the clay that I purchase matures to. So anything that I work with needs to be able to withstand that temperature or can be blended with other clays so that overall I can keep firing at that same temperature. Even though I don't have this test back yet, because it has not yet been fired, I'm pretty confident that this is a good stoneware clay. The sample that was brought to me earlier that I got a chance to process has a pretty good level of plasticity to it. That is its ability to stretch and form without cracking or tearing. This seems to be a good, this just seems to have good plasticity. It doesn't have a lot of grit in it. It's very malleable and it's light in color, which is why I believe it is a stoneware clay. Now, if you find clay in the wild, one field test that you can do is to get a sample of the clay that's damp and roll it in your hands a couple of times and fold it over. That is to squeeze the air out, homogenize the sample, and to align the clay particles so you get the best plasticity that you are able to in the moment. Once you've folded it over a handful of times, you can bend it, and what you're looking for is whether or not it cracks here and how much, because they almost always crack. So this hasn't cracked very much. I can see some fine cracks in it. That leads me to believe that the plasticity is good, plus just the way that it feels. If this clay were less plastic, I would expect to see bigger and a greater number of cracks, or the whole thing might just break in half when I bend it over like this. So knowing that the plasticity on this is pretty good, I think what I'm going to do is put it over on the potter's wheel in a little bit and try throwing it just as pure clay by itself without any additions and see how it goes. I'll probably make a separate short video about that just because, so keep an eye out for that later on. In the meantime, the way I am processing this clay is a wet method. I use a generous amount of water. The clay comes to me completely dried out in chunks. So what I'm going to do to process this, and by processing I only mean trying to purify the clay, get the vegetable matter out, get the rocks out, get the sand out as much as possible, so that I'm left with just clay material as much as possible. To do that, I'll fill a 5-gallon bucket full of water and I'll put a handful of these into it. That water will kind of shock the clay because it is completely dry, and it'll go down into the cracks in the clay, and it'll begin to disintegrate the outer layers of clay until the whole thing just breaks down into slurry in the bottom of the bucket, or it'll be a chunky slurry. After I've left it for several hours or sometimes overnight, I can come back in with a drill mixer and really mix that up well and break up any remaining chunks that are at the bottom of the bucket. And then I can pour that slurry through the first screen, which is a 40 mesh, to get out the roots and branches and stuff, the bigger rocks and the grittier sand. It takes a while. I use a brush to agitate it through the mesh. If I've added enough water, it's not a hard job. If I haven't added enough water and it's a thicker slurry, it takes longer. Once I get it through the 40 mesh screen, then I get another bucket, take the slurry and put it through the 60 mesh screen, which again, if it's thin enough, it goes through without problem. Before long, I have a 5-gallon bucket full of slurry that has been screened out to a 60 mesh particle size. That means all the coarse sand and even some of the finer grain sand is out of the clay. That's going to leave me with a pure clay body to work with. At that point, the process is simply getting all that extra water out of the clay. The first part of that, well, I'm impatient. So today what I did was I went ahead and poured the slurry into a handful of bisque-fired ceramic pans that I made a few years back for this purpose. Bisque-fired clay is porous. It's got enough porosity to it that it'll absorb some of the liquid from the slip, but more importantly, it'll evaporate that moisture out through the wall of the clay on the bottom, through the sides, while the slip itself, or the clay slurry itself, evaporates off the top. To add to that a little bit, and also to make the clay easier to get out of the bisque-fired pans later on, I use a fabric. It's commonly used in the furniture industry around here to wrap upholstered furniture for shipping to keep the dirt and dust and stuff off of it. It's synthetic, so it doesn't absorb water that effectively on its own. I mean, you can get it wet and it will hold some water, but what I have found is that it's great for lining that pan so that later on the clay is easier to get out, and it itself will absorb some of the water and help the evaporation process over time. But what I accidentally found is that if you wet this thoroughly before you lay it in the bin so that it's already saturated, when you do pour the slurry in, you'll get a wicking effect through the fabric, and so a lot of that water in the slurry will start wicking through the fabric itself and dripping down the sides and onto the floor and out to the sidewalk. So it's kind of filtering the water out of the slurry while leaving the clay particles behind. It really accelerates the drying process quite a bit. Once you have the slurry in the bisque-fired pans in the fabric, it can take anywhere from a week to several weeks for a handful of slurry to evaporate enough to a working consistency. When I get the fired results back for these bars, I may revisit where things stand with the project, but until then, take care, and I will talk to you again soon.